Hello, how are you doing? I hope you've read some good things over the month of March. I was quite busy, lots of busy reading, lots of book prizes going on, and it sort of felt like March kind of went by really quickly after January and February just sort of dragged on forever and ever. It sort of felt like March has just sort of flown by, and I guess that's partly because the weather is getting nicer outside here in London, but also we're sort of anticipating the end of lockdown or things sort of easing up over time, and that's just making the time go by quicker, I think. But yeah, so lots of book prize reading this month and other reading of different books. But starting off with some books from the Women's Prize that I read. So I finally read Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, which so many people have talked about already, and I thought was an absolutely extraordinary novel and will be such a strong contender, I think, for the Women's Prize. I mean, I haven't read all of the books yet, but I think this book is so moving and powerful, just like her first novel. But this novel is very different, all about a young woman named Gifty, who is a scientist studying the workings of the brain and behavior, and it follows her and her family and the tragedy of her family and growing up in a Midwestern town that is predominantly white, and going to a church that is predominantly white, and and how she has sort of grown out of that to become this scientist, to find herself in an environment where people still look down on her and judge her for continuing to have religious beliefs, or at least defend people who have religious beliefs, people who have sort of purely scientific kind of frame of mind. And I thought that was so interesting how she chose to do that and made a like real statement in doing that, because I think it's quite a common thing for people who grow up under slightly strict religious circumstances to rebel against that and sort of declaim the religious backgrounds that they came from. And I think it was so interesting how she is very critical of some of the interpretations of the religion she grew up under, but is still finds it such an empowering thing for so many people, like her mother, who draws so much power from her religion, even though the mother suffers from depression, and how she showed that. So I think Gifty emerges as this very powerful figure, but who has a lot of weaknesses, who's very defensive, and how she shows that vulnerability in her character, I thought was so moving. And I was just completely swept up in this story, and the way she portrays the brother and the tragedy of the brother who suffers from drug addiction, and how she shows that whole journey of the deep shame that Gifty feels about her brother's addiction, and getting over that, as well as the tragedy of what happens to him. It's such an incredible story. There's so many things to think about, and also it just made me feel so much that I think this is such a great novel, and many people have talked about it already, and to see the author talk about it as well. I've watched some interviews with her. I think it's so moving hearing her discuss it, and this so wonderful. And also Claire Fuller's amazing book Unsettled Ground, which I did an interview with her here on my channel, talking all about it, following a brother and sister who are 51 years old, and their mother dies because they're still living at home with her, and she dies quite suddenly at the very beginning of the book, and they've lived quite a insulated life, and it follows the through the perspective of the sister, and she in particular has been very sheltered her entire life, and she's suspected to suffer from a heart condition, and so that has meant she's lived quite a protective life at home, just sort of tending the garden and playing music with her family, and so then has to strike out on the world on her own, and is suddenly finds herself with all of this debt. Both she and her brother find themselves with all this debt, and are sort of thrown into poverty, and she follows the journey of this brother and sister, and it's so terrifying that the prospect of being in your 50s and finding yourself suddenly impoverished. And I think this is the situation for a lot of people that we just don't really hear from. So I think it's so extraordinary how Claire has written about this story, about characters that we don't often hear about, and people we don't often hear about in society that sort of fall by the wayside, and aren't able to support themselves, and so how she showed that journey and the real struggle of her life as she's trying to maintain her pride, while also trying to feed herself, I thought was so well done. It's such a moving story, but also has some real moments of lightness in showing the power of the relationship between this brother and sister. Even though they have their falling outs and their fights, they have a really strong connection with each other, and the joy they find in the music that they play together, and also the gardening that she does. And so yeah, I think this is such an incredible book in that it's a story like none I've read before, and I'm so happy to see it listed for this prize. I also think its chances are very good in the Women's Prize for Fiction, and there's so much more to say about this novel, but yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing it with more people. I also read debut novel Kololo Hill by Neema Shah, which I was really looking forward to because a month or two ago I'd read We Are All Birds of Uganda, which half of that novel portrays a period in Ugandan history when the Asians who lived in Uganda during the early 70s, when there was a military coup and a new figure in power who ordered Asians to leave the country. These were Asians that had come to Uganda during colonial times and helped build the business and the infrastructure of the country, and many of them had grown very wealthy and were very comfortable in Uganda, but then were forced to leave and had to surrender all of their property. And this was thousands of people that were forced to leave. So yeah, it's really heartrending story, and that was partly portrayed in that earlier debut novel, but also is really at the center of this novel because it portrays one such Asian family through the first half of the novel when they're living in Uganda up until the point when they have to leave under real duress in kind of emergency circumstances, and how some of them move to England to make a new life for themselves here, and how it showed that journey and the sort of before and after of that is so moving, and the different perspectives she shows in this family. It's told through the perspectives of three different characters, but mainly I think the real center of the novel is through a young woman who was just recently married before this being forced to leave the country, and how she and her husband are physically separated from each other after they're forced to leave in the beginning of the 70s, because he holds an Indian passport and she holds a British passport. And so this was quite a common thing too amongst many of these Asian families. They had different passports and so weren't physically able to live in the same country as each other anymore after being forced to leave Uganda. And how she shows that journey and the physical and the emotional journey of this family, I thought was so powerfully done. It raised so many questions about the meaning of home and how we make our homes. And so through the perspectives of these three different characters gives very different takes on that question of what our home means, whether that's family or the physical place we live, where we were born, where our descendants come from, or where we choose to embark out and make a new life for ourselves. And this is a question that I always ask myself as someone that was born and raised in America and has lived in England for over 20 years now. I sort of ask myself these questions about home and like, well, am I American or English now? And I obviously I didn't leave under such like duress, like circumstances as the family in this novel does, but I can still relate to a lot of the things that the novel is talking about in a very different way, while appreciating their very particular circumstance that they had, and the real heartache and strife of their circumstances. And so yeah, I found this novel incredibly moving and very powerful. I also read a couple of novels which I thought were very well done. So there's The Manningtree Witches by A.K. Blakemore, and also A Burning by Megha Mujumdar, which I think a lot of people have been talking about online and discussing. And I thought both of these novels were very good, but I don't know if it was just because of my emotional circumstances at the time when I read them, or if it was something like in the novels themselves. But I thought they were both technically very good, but I just didn't find myself absolutely loving them as I've loved some other novels that I read this month or previously. And so yeah, I think that's a interesting question to ask ourselves as readers sometimes, like how much is this just like me and my circumstances now, relating or not relating to this book, or is it it's something in the text themselves, or maybe it's a combination of both. But yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So The Manningtree Witches is a historical novel about the 16th century in the 1600s in England, when a number of witch trials were going on. There was a lot of religious strife at the time and a lot of tension. There were depletions in local communities of the men who had died in wars in recent time, and also a lot of religious persecution. And this sort of tension led to a lot of paranoia and a rise in the accusations of witches. So a lot of women and some men, but this novel mainly portrays a group of women that lived on the sort of fringes of a community in 1643 in England, and who found themselves accused of being witches, and it follows their trials going through that, and it shows it through the daughter of one woman who is accused of being a witch, and she's accused of being a witch herself, and so it's narrated through her perspective. And yeah, I thought it was all really well done. It's quite like vividly portrayed, both the historical period of that time and the circumstances, but also the mindset of this woman who finds herself almost driven to madness because of the paranoia of the time and the duress she's put under, and the women around her are put under as they're accused of being witches. And so some of it almost moves into the hallucinatory, or you start to wonder like is there something supernatural going on in addition to these accusations being made, or is it all just sort of in our mind and we're just seeing the realistic fallout of what happens in the circumstance. And I thought it was all really well done, but I just never found myself completely absolutely drawn into and moved by this novel. And so yeah, it just makes me wonder whether it was just me, or because I've been feeling like a bit melancholy for a while in this month, and the subject matter of this is quite depressing, and in the novel A Burning as well, it's quite depressing subject matter. And so I wonder maybe if I just wasn't in the right frame of mind to read it at that time. Obviously the other novels I talked about already included a lot of depressing subject matter, but I found there were aspects of them that I found like oddly comforting as well. But so yeah, I don't know if it was just the particular time or not. And so discussing the novel A Burning, this focuses on a young woman who is accused of being involved in the firebombing of a train, which in India, which led to the death of a number of people, and so she's arrested and put on trial for basically like betraying the country, being seen as a traitor to the country, and participating in these bombings, these terrorist bombings, and it follows her perspective, but also the perspective of two people who know her. One, a physical education teacher she knew at school, and also a character named Lovely, who is a Hijra, who lives in a Hijra community, and who wants to become an actress. And she was learning English from the character who is accused of being a terrorist. And they are sort of taken into the trial as character witnesses for Jivan, the character that's accused of being a terrorist. And so it follows their different stories and how basically it shows the overall corruption of the government, and how she's not really given a fair trial, either by the government forces or by the media that really portrays her as a villain, and how both the physical education teacher and Lovely are sort of corrupted by the system as well, and convinced into betraying Javan, and so yeah, it's overall like quite a depressing story, and but I think it's quite like noble in a way how she chose to write this story, that it doesn't that she doesn't give a lot of room for hope, and I think that is probably like quite true to the case of a lot of people who find themselves unfairly treated by their community. I mean, she does get some support by community. The community around her, there are protesters that come to speak in her defense, but they're completely overwhelmed by the system, which has basically already found her guilty. And so yeah, I found it quite a depressing novel, and especially in that how she makes you like, I think, the teacher and Lovely, and I felt a lot of affection for Lovely and was sort of rooting for her, and so it felt almost like a personal betrayal to the reader, myself, as I saw her betraying her former friend, and so I think that's quite a bold thing to do in a story, in a novel, and made it particularly heart-wrenching. And so I found it a very depressing book to read, and so I think it's a very good novel, but yeah, I think it was maybe like too much for me at the time when I was reading it. I just found it a bit too overwhelming. So technically I think these novels were very good, but yeah, I just didn't find myself completely gripped and loving them the way that I was hoping to. Also, I finally finished reading Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope, which I've talked about a number of times before. I've been reading it for a while as part of the Trollope Society's Big Read, and this is the third novel in the Barsetshire Chronicles that I've read, and yeah, and I found a lot of lightness and joy in this novel, because the way Trollope portrays this community is I think it's really tongue-in-cheek how he writes his narratives. So the main story is about a wealthy family, and that has fallen on hard times. They're well-respected members of the upper class, but their finances have really fallen by the wayside, and so the eldest son of the family, he needs to marry for money in order to help them maintain their position in society and prevent them from falling into bankruptcy. But he falls for a woman named Mary Thorne, who is the ward of Dr. Thorne, and we find out in the beginning that she was born under very scandalous circumstances, and so she's basically a bastard child who has been taken as a ward by this respected member of the community named Dr. Thorne. and yeah, and so it follows that story because she doesn't have any money or wasn't born to any money, but the son of this wealthy family falls for her, and so yeah, that's the sort of main tension of the story, which is sort of repeated again and again, and it does become slightly repetitious. I've seen some criticism of Anthony Trollope's work that he can be quite repetitious, and I think he sort of does that purposefully in a way, but it just didn't really. I mean, this novel wasn't serialized when it was first written, so that wasn't the reason why it was written in that way. I think that's just Trollope's style of writing, but he's so tender in there are some really tender scenes in this, both between Mary Thorne and Dr. Thorne, and but also between the son of this family and this wealthy woman named Martha Dunstable that the family tried to set him up to have a marriage with, and you see this real friendship growing between them, even though the family were sort of scheming to sort of capture her because she's a wealthy heiress. But Martha Dunstable is such an incredibly written character in that she knows that a number of men in this novel are sort of scheming to get with her to take her money, basically, and she sort of plays with them as she is being wooed by them, and she's such an amazingly written character. It was so pleasurable reading about her scenes, so which many of which are very like comic, but then like I said, yeah, there's also real tenderness and a real emotional intimacy to some of these scenes as well. So I'm just enjoying reading Anthony Trollope so much, and I'm looking forward to reading more by him. And it was a sort of welcome relief from some of this more depressing literature that I've been reading. I also read the nonfiction memoir Gay Bar by Jeremy Atherton Lin, which was such an interesting read. So this is subtitled Why We Went Out, which has sort of double meanings. It has a personal meaning for the author himself, who went out to lots of gay bars throughout his life with his long-term partner, and there they would have sexual interactions with men that they would meet there and pick up, both individually and as a couple. So there was that reason, but also he's looking at the broader question of why gay bars exist, why gay people found these physical locations important community spots where they could meet and come together to sort of form their identities, both individually and jointly as a community, but also, yeah, the practical issue too of meeting up with other gay men that they could have sex with, or maybe eventually form relationships with, and yeah, all those big questions. And so it's sort of his personal history of all the gay bars he's gone to, and how he was sort of documenting people he saw there, almost in a sort of sociological way, looking how these physical spaces can be great, serve as a great inspiration in the formation of identity, but also can be sort of stultifying in how it kind of consolidates this sense of identity and pressures people to conform to a certain like gay identity, or whether there even is a certain gay identity, and he asks all those questions in a really intelligent way, but also captures all the liveliness and fun and excitement and sexiness of these spaces. So I thought it was really fascinating and very moving as well, how he intellectually explores all these issues of identity, and but also like moving personally myself, because he lives in London for quite a while. I think he still currently lives in London. So a number of the bars he was talking about, he mentally talks about bars in London and also Los Angeles, and some in San Francisco as well. And many of these bars in London, like I've gone to myself, and even some people he met in these bars, I myself have known at one time or another, and so yeah, I felt real closeness to the content of this story and a real familiarity with it, even though I and someone who never always felt that comfortable going to bars. My experiences were very different from his experiences going to these bars, but nevertheless I could really relate to what he was talking about, and obviously felt very familiar with some of them. So yeah, I thought that this was a really fascinating book to read, and and really admirable book, and what he's done. I thought it was so well done. And then I also read a couple novels which are sort of like apocalyptic type novels. So there's Jessie Greengrass's new novel, The High House, which I've talked about Jessie Greengrass's work a lot before. I think she's such an extraordinary writer, and so this is her new novel, which is a sort of apocalypse novel of climate change, where basically the water levels rise and there's heavy rain, and a scientist discovers that this is going to cause a lot of change a lot sooner than people were expecting, or whether they were willing to admit was going to happen. And so she makes preparations within this house on an elevated it's a house that she inherited, and it's on an elevated property, where she makes provisions for when this is going to happen, and sort of prepares for this, but not for herself, but for her son, her very young son, and her stepdaughter, who go to live in this house after this sort of apocalyptic situation happens. And they also live there with a neighbor young woman and her grandfather, who become sort of caretakers of this house. And it follows their journey going into this house when this kind of apocalypse happens. And even though you know this is going to happen, that this is what's going to happen, at least I felt the heart stopping terror of their flight and moving into this house, and as the world is sort of collapsing around them, how she traces that journey is so terrifying and really vividly told. And I thought she captures that so well, but also just the emotional journey of it. And I don't know if with both of these novels, I don't know if it's just because of the circumstances of the past year that I find this is happening a lot for me. And a lot of what I'm reading, I'm sort of reading it through and interpreting it all through the circumstances of the past year and the pandemic. And so I related to a lot of this based on the past year and these kind of worries about society collapsing around us. And so this is another issue to do with reading. I think that we're obviously reading something in a particular time period, and even though this wasn't written, or at least the majority of this wasn't written during the pandemic, I'm still reading it through that perspective, and so yeah, I related to this book. A lot of the reasons why I related to this book was because of the past year, and even though it's obviously very depressing subject matter, I found it really beautiful how she wrote about just the physical labor they had of cultivating the farm that they still had to try to get enough to eat, even though they're relying a lot of the stores of what is left behind, and the physical objects of what they have, what was stored in this barn, that they are able to draw upon, but also thinking about the objects which were left behind, which they didn't take with them and just didn't think about, at the time when they were fleeing, going to this high house to live in. I found it strangely beautiful, just thinking about the physicality of their experience. It's difficult to describe, but yeah, I just thought it was so moving how Greengrass wrote about that experience and what is left behind, and their daily labor of trying to maintain themselves. And she doesn't do this in a sort of romanticized way. It's just really dealing with the physical objects of what is left behind. And I've sort of found this myself in my experience, and just what is in my apartment apartment, that is the world that I've been living in the past year, basically. Like, I have been able to physically go out and go to the shops and stuff and go to a local park, but mainly it's just been, what's around me. And I think so many people have been experiencing that in the past year. And so, yeah, and how she captures that, I just really related to. And so, yeah, I thought this is an amazingly written book. And also, just take a moment to appreciate the cover. I think this is such a beautiful cover as well. It's been published by a new publisher called Swift Press, and I just think it's a really incredible book. And so also with this novel, The Employees by Olga Ravn, which has just been longlisted for the Booker International Prize. So I already talked about it when I talked about the long list announcement for that book. But yeah, this is subtitled A Workplace Novel of the 22nd Century, because it's a science fiction novel about a spaceship that is inhabited by both humans and robots, robots that look very much like humans. They're called humanoids, and their exploration of a planet where they find a number of objects that they take on board and are sort of studying. And these objects might be living, or at least they react to the sun, and they have some strange reactions where they emit light or smells, and the people and the humanoids react to these smells in very strong ways, have very emotional and physical reactions to the objects that they are studying, and it takes the testimonies of a number of these humans and humanoids, and she explores so many interesting natures to do with mortality and what it means to be human through this, but also there's a plot throughout this novel of what is going on behind the scenes of this spaceship and the sort of sinister forces going on behind the scenes, and what ultimately happens with the spaceship itself is quite a thrilling journey through especially the second half of this novel. So I thought it was so inventive and really well done. And finally, I read the Japanese novel Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami, which is really two books sort of put together or published as one. I mean, it is a very similar story in that, or at least the story really follows through with itself, as it follows the main character who, in the first part of the novel, she's a kind of aspiring writer. She's been working on a novel for a long time, and her sister comes to stay with her along with her daughter, and it follows as the sister wants to get breast enlargements, and the daughter, it reproduces the daughter's journal entries in the novel, and how the daughter is contemplating the state of being a child and learning about reproduction, and her sort of terror around that, and then in the second half of the novel, it follows the main character after she's become a writer and is still trying to write more, but also contemplating having a child herself, through possible artificial insemination, and all of the questions surrounding that. So that's the main story of the books, and how this looks at the state of being a woman, but also the question of reproduction and children, and the moral responsibility of being a parent, and the question of having a child. It explores all these questions in a really interesting way, and I thought this novel was really moving and fascinating and interesting, and it's really good to see that more of this Japanese author's work is being translated into English, because I'm really looking forward to reading more of her work. So yeah, this has been a slightly rambling account of what I've read over the past month, but yeah, things are a bit hectic at the moment. I have a lot going on with like work, and also it's my partner's birthday soon, so I'm gonna go out and make a cake now soon for his birthday. But those are all the books I read. So let me know if you've read any of these books, and if you have any thoughts about them, or if you're interested in reading any of them now, based on what I've said about them. I'll also put links below to my full reviews of these books if you want to hear my more coherent thoughts about these books. But also, yeah, let me know what you read over the month of March, what you really enjoyed, or maybe what you didn't enjoy. But also, yeah, if you relate to any of these issues that I've talked about, of whether the mood you're having when you're reading a book, do you think, has that really affected your reading experiences sometimes? Or if, just because of the circumstances of the past year, do you find you're doing this as well? Like, reading everything you're reading, you're sort of reading it through the filter of the pandemic and the circumstances that we've found ourselves in. I think those are kind of interesting questions to ask ourselves as readers, and how we respond to what we're reading. Anyway, I'll stop rambling now, and I'll go off and bake a cake. So, but I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.